Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Last Night in Soho. I would say of all the Edgar Wright films I've seen, and I've seen all of them other than like the very first one, I would say this is the worst Edgar Wright film that he's ever made. It is a movie that kind of goes on to the adage, which I almost feel like I shouldn't be saying this. I feel bad about saying this because I like Edgar Wright a lot. I think he's a great filmmaker. I've seen most of his films several times, even if like Baby Driver, for example, I wasn't that into, but it was on cable while my daughter was a baby and wake up at night, and I just happened to watch it a lot. It was fun to watch. It's not a deep movie or anything, but these are movies I love having on, and I love being with these characters, and I like hearing interviews with them and all that stuff. But Last Night in Soho, as a movie, is just not very good. And it plays like a director, like the adage that you always hear about if a director is not a horror director and messes with the genre, they often do not understand how it works. And I feel like Edgar Wright does know how a horror movie works. I mean, I've seen Shaun of the Dead. I feel like he's seen a few horror movies. I think we'd all agree that. But I cannot tell that as much in this movie. And it feels like almost like the structure in some ways shows someone who knows Argento, who knows Hammer, who knows a horror movie, but he doesn't really understand why. What story they're telling, what are the things that they're not telling you underneath, all those sort of things. And in a lot of ways, like things like Suspiria and films that take place in kind of a small town or in the country can get away with because, you know, they take place in a small town in the country. And this film takes place in London, in Soho, in the Soho area specifically, and almost feels incapable of really dealing with the multiple amount of issues that just kind of skirts by in a way that more feels like he has like a complete lack of life experience to deal with those things than, you know, sort of a cool creative choice that he's sort of avoiding it. My experience viewing this film is, you know, I had heard not great things about it, but I was sort of into the idea. It's like this girl, she leaves her small town, goes to London. You know, she has the Shining or the Shining or whatever. She can see dead people. She sees her mom in the mirror. I actually had a whole theory about her mom, which isn't true. My own personal headcanon, I guess. But that she had died, but she can like see her in the mirror. Her grandmother is aware of this. She goes to London. She has a terrible experience with the dorms. Somehow can afford to live in an apartment in London, which I don't know the rents, but I'm just going to go out on a whim here and say there's like no fucking way a college student can afford those things. But in this fantasy, I guess she can, working at a bar in 2021. She moves out because the dorm sucks and she moves into an apartment. Her landlord or landlady is Diana Rigg. And in her final performance, sadly, this is also the final performance of, was also Margaret Nolan, who is her, the barkeeper, I believe. Not just Diana Rigg's final performance, to be clear, although Diana Rigg is a great actress, and it was amazing in this role. The girl, played by Thomasin McKenzie, she starts seeing visions of the 60s and going into the body of this woman from the 60s, in the 60s, played by Anna Taylor-Joy, and how she is basically destroyed from her dreams of being a singer and just becomes a prostitute who's just sort of eaten up by London, and she has to come to terms with how she, who's very nostalgic for the 60s, the real life 1960s, and also figuring out the murder of Anna Taylor-Joy's character and what happened to her. There's a lot at the beginning of this that feels like he understands the flow and the structure of a horror movie. It's sort of weird when you see that and it doesn't work out, because most of the time you're like, oh, okay, this person understands genre. And in a sense, the way it is structured and edited and shot, it feels like he sort of does, which is so deceptive, because like when you get to the meaning of it, oh, he doesn't. And if he did and it meant, I don't think it did, because there's so many misdirects that go nowhere and mean absolutely nothing. A major one with a major character that was pretty sad that he attempted that. I don't know what he was doing with it. It felt like someone who got to a certain point with it but didn't understand why he was moving those pieces in a certain way, and it almost invalidates my feelings previously. But I like the idea of playing with nostalgia, and even nostalgia for times you didn't live in. You know, as someone who's a big cinephile and I love older films, sometimes you'll think about those times and you'll watch those movies and have this imagined view of it. And there's certain ways to confront that. I actually think there's a lot of ways this plot could have the idea that she wants to be a fashion designer in London and how she's having a hard time, but also the advantages she has versus technology and so forth. Whereas the Anya Taylor-Joy character, like if you wanted to sing and no one will give you a shot, it's sort of over for you. Now, if you want to be a singer, you can make a YouTube channel, you can upload to Spotify or wherever. There's avenues you have to get discovered or at least put your art out. And there could be a back and forth about that, an interesting dissection of those sort of things. But this film isn't really interested in that. It wants to tell a ghost story that doesn't really work. It like switches tense, and it feels like that they sort of changed their minds about what the mystery was about or something. But it just like so much of it works in certain ways or feels like it works, but it's sort of a lie. And even though this is shot by Chung-hoon, I believe, or the DP of Old Boy, he shot a lot of Park Chan-wook's various films, The Handmaiden. I know at least he shot a bunch of stuff, but he didn't work with Bill Pope on this, which I think was probably a mistake. Him and Bill Pope seemed to work much more simpatico, and this it was probably one of his worst kind of. A badly shot Edgar Wright film is still a very well shot film, but it felt like especially when they weren't in the ghost world, it felt like sort of any other movie, like just like a normal kind of horror film. And when they're in the fantasies, you could tell that Edgar Wright flair, but it's almost like he didn't know how to use a DP that wasn't Bill Pope. Like it feels like I don't know how much work Bill Pope is putting into these films, that he's like making these films pop more than they ordinarily should. And also like his editing and cutting style wasn't the Edgar Wright thing. And I get that he wants to feel more mature, but it's kind of hilarious that like aesthetically he went for mature, whereas the film itself I don't think is very mature at all. He should have relied on his auteurism and why he has that there to kind of mask something. Like I think you get a lot of these stylish directors and you imagine like, well, then they'll make their film that like really means something and stuff, and they'll be able to use this style for something. And it almost feels like between Baby Driver and this, he just doesn't know how to do that when it's not involving Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. And I normally like a lot of his British stuff. I think I would rank almost all his British films over his American ones, and even Space and all that stuff that I've seen. But this is this is just so disappointing, because it just, like, watching this makes me feel like he's not as deep as I thought he was, you know. And even though it has a great final performance from Diana Rigg, which is great, I like seeing Terrence Stamp in this, which is interesting to show him, because there's with the Limey and everything, with nostalgia with that film and with this, although that film I think started so many discussions at the time, because the Limey, if you didn't know, used older footage of Terrence Stamp from a previous movie and like put it into the narrative of the film, which now seems sort of quaint, but at the time was like considered a big deal. But it almost felt like he didn't really know how to use Terrence Stamp, which you could see in the narrative of the film. And like anything to do with Me Too, this film completely falls apart. When you get to the thesis of these things, it just feels wrong and bad, and you're like, don't think they fully get what they're saying. And if you go deeper into it, I don't think you're going to even like what he was saying with it. It just doesn't make me feel great about any of it. You know, I think it was a false front of a kind of psychological horror film that didn't really, you know, I didn't really come together. You know, I get sort of what he was doing and what the influences were, but you have to use those things. And like previously when he did, he found a sort of truth in that, and I don't think he knew what the truth of this really was. I don't think he understood what he was doing with this, you know. Some of those kind of horror, the Hammer stuff and all that stuff, they did kind of have to churn those films out in a certain way, and not all of them had that meaning behind them. But I expect a little more for Edgar Wright, since these are like these big original productions he spends so much time on. And then you get this and you're like, oh, it's just, the more I think about it, the logic doesn't work, which is terrible for a mystery. It almost makes me just want him to just do the auteurism stuff. I know he was like going to make a sequel to Baby Driver, and he chose to do this instead. I think that was probably a huge mistake. I would say it's a complete sort of failure of him as a director, because it kind of shows what you thought there was more deeper meaning there, and you find it and you find out there's nothing. You're sort of disappointed, and you kind of think, maybe I liked living in a world where I thought this would work a little better than it was. Maybe you're not as versatile, you know? That's what I thought after watching this. I just wanted to see, like, even the Edgar Wright of Baby Driver was, like, entertaining, you know? And this wasn't entertaining, because the entertaining part of a horror film, especially like this one, is to have a certain amount of a point, and I don't, you know, to say something. You know, horror is about stuff. like George Romero. I don't know if you've seen any George Romero, but he should. It hurts me a little bit. You know, I will say that. But I don't really ever want to really watch this film again. You know, the other ones I either watched by accident or so forth, but I still enjoyed watching them. Even Scott Pilgrim, I enjoy having that on. I get that he wanted to do something different, and, you know, it was an absolute failure, and he should, like, absolutely never do it again. You know, the fantasies were fun. The idea of going into the 60s is fun, but he doesn't, you know, for swinging London and that area and stuff, like, understand, like, the economic boom of that time of, like, you know, the post-World War II era, and it was finally coming around. And that's what, when I see those films, that's sort of what they're referencing and talking about. And, like, does he not see those movies? Does he not understand the broader historical ramifications and stuff? There's so many things I think you could have gone into with this time travel story, and then you just get this very lame, silly ghost story that doesn't fully work. My headcanon thing was basically that her mom, who's dead, who'd gone to the city and lost control, could do the Shining thing too, and was in an apartment, and because there's so many more people who've lived and died in the city, she went sort of insane, and that, like, this is happening to her daughter as well. That was never revealed, that she had the same thing as her daughter or anything like that. And it could have been a thing about, like, you know, the country versus the city, and there's, like, way more people who've been destroyed in the country versus the city. Basically the idea. It's not a full allegory of, you know, the typical narrative of that cities are evil and the country is wonderful, and, you know, nothing bad ever happens there or whatever. But it doesn't even fall into that. It just, like, I think he got the idea of concept and the style of a horror movie, but he didn't really get why you do a psychological thriller, and that just, it's just disappointing. You know, I kind of wonder why he watches movies now, and I think he needs something that works more for his auteur's style than this. You know, I think we've always wanted him to do a push to these things, and I just don't think, I think it works within his own stuff, which I guess this is, but I think something, maybe he needs to lean more into being Edgar Wright and less into this, which I feel bad about saying. You know, I feel bad for saying all these things about this movie, but I also sort of feel bad for myself for experiencing this and being sort of let down cinematically by this film, because it feels like the promise is there. You want the promise to be there. It's like a frustrating watch, not because of the reputation of Edgar Wright necessarily. I also think because you feel like there could be something cool here, and almost like, you know, someone who is nostalgic for something. But when you know, I think in this film you find out there's far more context there. The sad thing about me versus the character, or you as the viewer, really, is that you find out there isn't anything there. And what is there is just kind of like a string about ideas that you're like, wait, what? That was stupid. So if you've seen Last Night in Soho and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.